Okay, good evening, everybody. It's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening. So, this is UFOs. You can see from the subtitle, I'm asking the question, are there any images that need an extraterrestrial explanation? I'm not going to be talking about anecdotal evidence and people saying things about UFOs. This is strictly about looking at some images, mainly images that I found, the sort of images that you tend to find if you look on the internet or sometimes on TV. And I'm asking the question, are there any simple explanations for what it is we're actually looking at? So, statistics don't lie. Let's start with just thinking about UFOs generally. If we ask the question, and we ask the question of Americans rather than people in Europe, have extraterrestrial aliens visited the Earth? Apparently, amongst Americans, about 40% might say yes. And the source of this information is a survey that's a few years old now, 2018, but you can go and look at that survey if you wish. If you ask a slightly different question, are aliens visiting now, rather than historically, Van Daniken style, have they visited in the distant past, are they actually amongst us now, you'd expect a lower number. But it's not lower by much, it's 35%. That's less, admittedly, than the number of people who believe in ghosts, but it's greater than the number of people who believe in telekinesis and the number of people who believe in Bigfoot. But rather worryingly, it's actually larger than the number of people who believe in evolution. Amongst Americans, remember this is. I would like to know what those numbers are for Europeans or people in the UK, but I can't find quite the same survey having been dealt with here. But that's a rather sobering thought, that more people believe that aliens are amongst us than believe that evolution is a valid theory. And another perspective on UFOs and various other similar phenomena is this observation from XKCD that makes the observation that if you look at the percentage of, again, American in this particular case, the percentage of Americans that have carried a camera with them everywhere they go for their entire waking lives, you see that that number was very small in the 80s and 90s, but started climbing with the advent of smartphones. And of course, now we must be fairly close to 100%. So you would think that that would in itself be evidence that you've conclusively settled the argument of UFOs and flying saucers, lake monsters, ghosts, and Bigfoot, because surely by now we would have evidence if they did exist. So you could say, well, it should be settled, but clearly it's not settled, because if you simply Google UFO, you don't find a few thousand web pages, you don't even find a few million web pages. Last time I checked, there were more than 250 million web pages that gave a hit to the search for UFO. Some of them might be the rock group under that name, but I think most of them are unidentified flying objects. So that implies that despite the fact that cameras are everywhere, this issue is still not settled. And what I'm going to do in this talk, given that it's getting late, I'll cut it down from the usual 3 hours to no more than 1.5. I'm going to look at images that can be categorized as either man-made objects or natural objects or image artifacts or deliberate fakery. And of course, the elephant in the room is that there aren't just those 4 categories. We have to admit there is a 5th category, and yes, UFOs could be extraterrestrial aliens visiting the Earth in spacecraft. So let's just make sure we've got a few definitions sorted out. I will use the word UFO in the usual sense, the conventional sense, to mean an object not readily identified. Usually in the sky, quite often at night, but not universally the case. And regarding an extraterrestrial origin for UFOs, I would definitely side with Carl Sagan. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And another useful tool, not just for UFOs, but in any rational science, is Occam's razor, which says that if there are 2 explanations for the same thing, then the explanation that requires the least amount of speculation is more likely to be the correct explanation. That's usually paraphrased as, if you've got more than one solution for a particular problem, then the simpler one is more likely to be correct compared to the complex one. So I'm going to show you various images, and you can either interpret them as evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, or I'll give you an alternative, simpler explanation, which I believe is probably the right one. So where can you get reliable information about UFOs? Well, it's a bit tricky. There are UFO information centers around the world, but the ones in America are pretty much like this, and there's always an alien on the porch out front as well. So it's difficult to get reliable information. You can always get accounts, which are quite often second-hand or third-hand or fourth-hand, rather than actually talk to people that have seen something. And even there, you're relying on their memory. So I'm relying on images rather than anything else. It would be really nice if all the images looked like this. If all the images were nice and clear and detailed, and the camera produced an image that was in focus without any movement of the camera, and well exposed if it was taken in daylight. That would be great, because then we could definitively say, yep, that is quite definitely an alien spaceship. But actually, UFOs don't tend to look like that. Most UFOs look like that. They are usually blurred, out of focus, there's loads of camera movement, and if they're taken at night, they're almost universally overexposed to the point where you can't actually see anything. You take that little blur and you say, well, let's zoom in a bit so we can see more detail. No, you can't see more detail, it's just a bigger blur. Like looking through the Earth's atmosphere at a star, increased magnification doesn't necessarily help. So it's a bit of a shame. We don't have a very good database of images to work with. We just have a few. I tried to find one of the first indications of a UFO. I found this hieroglyph. At first, I thought that this hieroglyph had simply been modified in Photoshop in order to show what looks like, I don't know, a helicopter. It looks like a bit like an Apache helicopter in the top left, Luke Skywalker's speeder over on the right-hand side, and maybe a Zeppelin below that. All of these things look very odd, and it's easy to assume that they've simply been photoshopped. But no, this is a genuine piece of rock. But the explanation is, in a sense, even simpler than somebody has taken the original image and photoshopped it. What we're looking at is not a set of hieroglyphs, it's actually two sets of hieroglyphs. Because when Seti was reigning over Egypt, he had a particular set of hieroglyphs carved onto this particular rock. And then Ramses II came along a few decades later and decided to put his hieroglyphs, and they sort of left the old ones in place as well as chiseling new ones, and so you actually get a superposition of these two hieroglyphs. And if you color them separately for Seti and for Ramses, one in blue and one in green, then you can see how perfectly innocuous shapes like a woodworking tool or birds and various other glyphs here, when superposed, can give you the impression of some very odd shapes. So that's purely a coincidence, an effect of superposing two sets of images. A bit like a double exposure, if you like, in modern terms. So let's go through a few of these images and see if we can make sense of them. Some UFOs are quite definitely man-made objects. And just to help you along the way, the US Air Force realized that you're going to see some man-made objects and confuse them with UFOs. So just in case what you think you're seeing is either a UFO or a super-secret aircraft, the US Air Force is making it easier for you. And here we see in the top left, that's actually a weather balloon. You may think it's a super spy plane, but no, it's a weather balloon. Second one is a weather balloon. Third one is a weather balloon. Fourth one is a weather balloon. Fifth one is a weather balloon. Any idea what the sixth one is? Swamp gas. The next one is weather balloon, weather balloon, weather balloon. And then, nope, not the USS Enterprise, a weather balloon, and again, not the B-2 bomber. It's just a weather balloon. So that sort of helps us get the thing sorted, and thank you for the US military for providing that ID chart. But if you look at something like that, this is understandable. I've never seen anything quite like that. But you can imagine if you ever saw something like that lurking in the sky, it would be very easy, if you didn't know what you were looking at, to say, wow, that looks extremely extraterrestrial. I've never seen anything like that before. In fact, it's just a rocket launch. We've had a lot of Falcon launches in the last few years. The last 5 years have had quite a few. And if they're launched close to sunset, then when the rocket gets into the sky, the sun can catch the rocket trail, and even if the rocket itself is barely visible in front of that plume, the actual plume, the exhaust plume left by the rocket, can be lit up by the sun and can produce some fairly spectacular shapes. And of course, most people who see this know that because it's in the news about a rocket launch. So no one is actually going to confuse this with a UFO unless you really didn't understand what was going on. And some of the effects can be quite spectacular. The exhaust plumes left by a Falcon 9, for instance, shortly after it's launched, can be quite spectacular, as indicated by this image, and even more so by this one, where in a sense you're looking through the plume at the rocket that's almost going away from you. As a sort of coincidence of the line of sight, this image was taken, and so a lot of the rocket plume has now dissipated. The exhaust plume that left the rocket some minutes ago has slowly dissipated, producing this huge nebula, while the rocket continues on its way, producing again some small plumes visible in the distance there. And I guess some sunset clouds are creeping into the right-hand side of the picture. So it can produce some rather spectacular shapes, which can look rather otherworldly when you look at them like this. Similarly, some rocket trails can catch the sun. Again, most of the time, if they're launched in the day, you don't notice. If they're launched at night, you can't see the trails. But if they're launched close to sunrise or sunset, then the sun can catch the contrail. And in this particular case, the contrail that may have started relatively straight has been distorted by some high winds in the atmosphere. And then you get these beautiful iridescent clouds here because of the molecules that are left over in the rocket plume, the rocket exhaust. You get this iridescence where, depending on the angle of the sun, you can get various colors show through. So again, it can look really weird depending on the shapes that are generated and depending on the colors. But it's perfectly explicable just in terms of rocket science. Again, looking at this, if you didn't know what was going on, you might think, again, this looks very odd. Not only have we got multiple splodges in the sky, we've got different splodges of different sizes and different colors, and it all looks really weird. And if you didn't know what was going on, you could quite easily convince yourself this is an extraterrestrial invasion of some kind. In fact, this is just the result of man trying to find out how the upper atmosphere works. In other words, trying to get a better idea of the dynamics of aurora, send up sounding rockets, release some chemicals that fluoresce under the influence of the sun, and as the gases disperse, you can get an idea of how they behave under solar radiation, and you can also get an idea, if you look at the ones at the lower altitudes, you can see how they're moving, you can get an idea of what the winds are in the upper atmosphere. So this is really just a release of various chemicals at various heights in order to give us an idea of what the upper atmosphere is doing. Occasionally you may notice I put a little APOD link in the bottom there. That's the astronomy picture of the day, and there's a date there if you want to go and chase those up. I'm making handouts available to you if you wish. You can go and look up the astronomy picture of the day for that day and find more information about what I'm showing here. This has often been confused with a UFO as well. This is Google Loon. A little while ago, Google had a project in which they were going to put large balloons into the stratosphere in order to improve internet connectivity for various parts of the world. As of a few months ago, they've trashed that particular project. They've said it's unviable. I'm not sure that means that they think that SpaceX and satellites are going to do a better job rather than putting large balloons into the stratosphere. But these were put into places where it was difficult to get internet connections, remote parts of New Zealand. There was also a pilot project in Kenya where they put these up to see if they could improve the internet connectivity. But it proved to be essentially too expensive for individual consumers. They were still being charged $1,000, so it wasn't suitable for everybody anyway, in much the same way that SpaceX is going to cost. The connectivity through SpaceX Starlink satellites is going to be relatively expensive. But given that these things are 15 or so meters in diameter and very reflective, you can imagine if you had a lot of these floating around in the atmosphere, it would be very easy to confuse them with other lights in the sky which have a more extraterrestrial origin. And perhaps you're familiar with this. We've seen more of these recently. This is a few years ago, and you can see when you see dancing lights on the sky, You can either believe that it's a fleet of extraterrestrial spacecraft, but these are becoming common enough now that people are starting to recognize them, and rather than thinking of them as rather odd, you can see they're changing their color as well as changing their shape. This is simply a set of drones, and these days the actual coordination and positioning of the drones is much more accurate. So here it's a little bit scrappy in that the positioning is not very accurate to within maybe just a few meters, but now they can get relative positions of drones and fly them with lights in order to produce spectacular aerial imagery, which again can start to mimic any shape you like. So if you wanted to outline the shape of a flying saucer using a few hundred drones, it would be very easy to do that. So I'm sure we are going to see in the future lots of UFO reports of various people doing these drone cloud displays. It's been claimed that from the air you can see obvious places where UFOs have landed. These are clearly landing sites for UFOs. It's quite easy to check this. People are quite quick to say, I've seen UFO landing pads. What they're not so quick to do is to say, well, I saw them on a flight from A to B, and I saw them at this time of day. Let me check where the aircraft was at that time of day, if it's flying from A to B, and let's have a look at what's in the desert at that particular location. If people bothered to do that, they would find that at that particular location, there were solar power plants with lots of reflecting mirrors, which all reflect the heat of the sun up to a furnace in which you then collect the power, or you use it for incineration. But depending on how the sun hits the mirrors, depending on from what angle you're trying to photograph this particular collection of mirrors, you can see that it gives the sort of effect that we saw just a moment ago, such that if you're at a few thousand feet looking down, you get a rather odd effect. But it's simply an odd effect of having thousands of mirrors trying to reflect the rays of the sun. If we have a look at, you'll notice I've borrowed a few of these off either YouTube or other sites in which people are showing videos. One person was getting very excited about the fact that there's clearly a UFO hovering over the lake there. He was so excited he couldn't keep his camera very steady. Having it steady for a few seconds is quite unusual, which is why these things tend to always leap all over the place, because then it makes it very much more difficult to see what's going on. I haven't included the soundtrack, because that's very annoying, but the soundtrack is basically somebody shouting, look, it's obviously a UFO, it's fantastic, it's huge, it's hovering over the lake. I'm the first person ever to video a UFO, or something to that extent. It was in various newspapers, and it's been on the web for a long time, and it's got an awful lot of hits, despite the fact that within hours of the video being posted, the people that were responsible for that particular object came out immediately and said, sorry guys, I don't want to get in the way of a good story, but that's quite definitely us. It's the Goodyear blimp. That's all it is. There was a football stadium not that far away, and the Goodyear blimp is always there taking aerial photos of sporting events. But despite the fact that they admitted this is nothing extraterrestrial, it's just a Goodyear blimp, still that story persisted. As soon as something gets posted onto the internet, it is very difficult to tear it down again. It's very difficult. Even if you say this has been explained, there will still be people saying, yeah, wow, fantastic, yeah, definitely proof of alien invasions, etc. It's just a fact of modern society that as soon as you put something sensational on the internet, even though it gets explained, it will stay on the internet, and it will make people assume that the original story is still valid, despite the fact that it had been trashed perhaps only hours later. Yes, UFOs are not always what you think. Footwear in space is indeed a real thing. Anything can now be thrown into space, including 90-year-old actors and various other things. So here, for instance, just as a publicity stunt, Nike decided to send some of their footwear into space. And although a trainer is not going to be easily visible from great distances, who knows what else is going to be thrown up there? If you look up at the balloon that's holding this thing in place, that's what happens to all balloons, all weather balloons and other type objects that get lifted into the upper atmosphere. Eventually, the internal pressure of whatever gas is used, helium, eventually shreds the balloon, and down it comes again. So a trainer is not going to be confused with a UFO, but if you can put footwear in space, you can essentially send anything you like up there into the atmosphere, and then you'll have a few million people looking at various objects floating around, getting thoroughly confused. How happy was I when I came across something that said super clear footage of a UFO? Super clear in inverted commas. I thought, fantastic, at last we now have something that will give us a really nice super clear footage. I really was excited by the idea of this daylight video. So here's the super clear footage of the UFO. Anybody care to guess what it is? Admittedly, after a little while, the person taking this video did settle down a little bit, and eventually we did get an idea of what it was that was being photographed. Either because I don't think the object was moving much at all, it was probably being carried along by the wind, but eventually the person taking the video did settle down, and then we can see quite clearly it's not a UFO, it's just a party balloon. Possibly somebody named Jane or Jeremy or perhaps something else has got a big mylar balloon in the shape of a letter J, and up it went and got carried away, escaped from the party. But it is so easy for anybody to take a picture of anything that looks even the slightest bit unusual, post it onto YouTube, and you'll get thousands and thousands of people saying, wow, that's fantastic. It's, again, just an indication of how the modern world works. Let's have a think of the other category. UFOs might be natural objects rather than man-made objects. I assume you've all seen Cloud of the Month. Yes, the Cloud Appreciation Society has a web page which they call Cloud of the Month. And every month they have a new cloud. So a few years back, January's Cloud of the Month was these rather nice lenticular clouds. And then later in that year, November, they had a rather odd formation, which I don't think I've ever seen, which is a large circle in the sky, which is made of these little nodules, as it were. And again, you look at that and you think that looks very artificial, but is it artificial in the sense of a UFO is producing that, or is there some other explanation for how you can get a big circle in the sky? Well, strictly speaking, it's not a circle, it's a semicircle, and it's difficult to see what the rest of that formation looks like. And it's not obvious, unless you have seen these before, exactly what is forming them. But what's actually happening is that because there's a cloud layer there at a couple of thousand feet or so, there's actually an aircraft just above the cloud base. And as aircraft travel, they change the pressure and temperature because of the way the air is flowing over the wings and through the engines. And a slight change in the temperature and pressure behind the aircraft is producing a disruption of the clouds. You can't see the aircraft because it's still within the cloud, but you can see the effect on the cloud. And this particular aircraft is simply in a holding pattern waiting to come into a nearby airport. And hence you get this rather artificial, and it is indeed artificial, cloud formation, because it's effectively a plane that is disrupting a cloud that already exists. A couple of years later, a rather nice lenticular cloud. We've all seen these sorts of pictures before that look a little bit like flying saucers. That one I think is spectacular. It's not really a UFO, but it does remind me of the opening sequence of Independence Day. For those who know their sci-fi, that looks like a UFO is about to burst out of this cloud and starting to rain hell on the population of Earth. That one's quite a nice one because it looks like a circular hole, seen from a little bit of an angle. It looks like a circular hole in the cloud layer, as if something has just punched through and perhaps landed below and left a circular hole in the cloud layer above. So that indeed does look very odd, but I'm not going to go through the detail, but there are meteorological ways that that can happen naturally to do with the condensation point and the temperature and pressure within a particular part of the cloud. It can be that these so-called full street clouds can exist naturally. So it doesn't have to have anything mechanically punching through a hole in the clouds to give that sort of effect. So clouds of the month do give some very interesting images, and you can sort of understand that some of them might be confused with, are these of artificial origin? You can get some very unusual cloud formations, such as a type of lenticular cloud that's forming here over Mount Fuji. That in itself is quite spectacular, but that doesn't stop people taking this image, putting it into Photoshop and saying, can we make it even more unusual? Well, yes, we can. And that has done the rounds quite a few times on the internet without acknowledging the fact that the lenticular cloud in itself, the original, is actually quite spectacular, even before you think about adding a few more on top of it. If you go to colder climes, you sometimes see so-called light pillars, which again look very odd. If you're not used to seeing these, if you live in these sorts of latitudes, you probably see this all the time. But for people who live in warmer climes, the idea of seeing what appear to be lights radiating, are they coming down from above? Are they lights that are almost floodlights? Who on earth would set up floodlights and point them vertically into the sky? So again, trying to explain this looks a bit odd until you realize what's going on in terms of the water in the atmosphere. This is a perfectly natural situation where ice crystals form in the atmosphere at certain latitudes, at certain times of year, at certain times of day, when the temperature conditions are right and the humidity is right. Ice crystals can form in the atmosphere, and some ice crystals preferentially sit horizontally. They are plates, if you like, hexagonal plates. And if they sit horizontally, then they effectively make a mirror, such that as you look up onto this surface, you're looking at lights that are somewhat more distant, and you can see a reflection. And because most of these plates are horizontal, because that's the natural way they want to sit, it's very unnatural for one of these plates to tilt over at an angle. So because most of these plates are horizontal, you tend to get reflection of more distant lights. And you can see that here. You get an impression of the lights. You can't necessarily see the lights themselves. They're hidden behind the trees in the distance. But you can then see these light pillars, which, because they are relatively horizontal, they give this impression of a beam of light coming from the ground. And the colors are purely a reflection of whatever the original light source is. One of my favorite images is this one, simply because the light pillars appear to be so detached from the actual source, and you can see the source of the lights are down here, these white and red lights in the very distance, some miles away. And in this particular case, the conditions are such that the ice crystals have formed quite high, and so you get these reflections high up in the sky. And under certain circumstances, the ice crystals will be nice and horizontal up to a particular height where things start to get a little bit warmer, and then the ice crystals start to move and they don't sit quite as horizontal, which means the light pillars start to flare out and you get this very odd tree-like effect, but still with the base of each light pillar coming from a particular light source, which you may or may not be able to see in the distance. So a rather spectacular vision, but probably perfectly normal for those that live at these sorts of latitudes. A video here of some oddity in the sky. There's a couple of houses either side. The sun is off to one side, but something very odd is flickering in the middle there and appears to be moving extremely fast. Over a fraction of a second, it seems to move quite a considerable distance. Given that this cloud could be 1 or 2 kilometers away, whatever's moving there seems to be moving faster than the speed of sound, which seems very odd. And again, you can say, is it a UFO that's hiding in the cloud and it's sort of, it's making its presence felt by the fact that we're seeing these odd flashes in the sky when we photograph them. Again, I don't think this has been filmed very often. I can only find 1 or 2 videos along these lines. But if you show this to a meteorologist, they will say immediately, yeah, that's easily explicable. This is a thundercloud, and there's huge electric fields. It hasn't yet necessarily produced any lightning. There's been no discharge of the charge that's building up from the cloud to the ground, but there are definitely large electric fields, large charges being generated, plus over here, minus over there, in different parts of the cloud. And as soon as you have different charges in the cloud, you can start orienting the ice crystals. The ice crystals will sit in a particular orientation depending on whether there's positive charge over here or negative charge over there. And so if the cloud is changing because inside the cloud electric charges are moving backwards and forwards, then you can suddenly get changes in the orientation of the ice crystals. So nothing is actually moving here in the sense that there's nothing jumping to the left or jumping to the right, despite what you see in the light flashes there. If I go back and just show you again, nothing is actually physically changing. It's only ice crystals that are changing their orientation and hence reflecting the sun differently. So when you think you see something jump, it's actually just ice crystals changing orientation, not physically moving at the speed of sound off to the left or off to the right. So again, understanding that is just a question of understanding the dynamics of water and ice and electric charges inside clouds. This is more obscure in the sense that we still don't really understand what's going on here, and these haven't been photographed until fairly recently. But red sprites are thought to occur above thunderclouds. So we are all familiar with the idea that in a thundercloud, electric charges get separated into plus and minus, and at some point you get a lightning strike from the thundercloud down to Earth as the cloud discharges. But it's also been found that you get discharges above a thundercloud. So it's a little bit like lightning, except it's going up into space rather than down into the ground. And it's not as bright as this particular photograph would have you believe. I'm not sure. I think you can see them visually, but all of the ones I've seen appear much brighter than you can account for, and I think that's just a result of the processing of the images. But we're still trying to understand exactly what's going on. But again, there's nothing unearthly about these things. It's just a phenomena related to thunderstorms which we don't fully understand yet. This is coming back to something that was mentioned just literally a few minutes ago. Can we work out what's meant by an arc-shaped UFO seen over Ontario? I'll show you the image in just a second, but first I'll give you the description that accompanied this particular UFO sighting. It was nearing the end of the day. I sat down on my deck facing west. Something caught my eye. It was brilliant white. You can probably already figure out what it is. It's in the evening, you're looking west, and you see something brilliant white. What is it going to be? In truth, I cannot be sure what it is. My conclusion is a UFO. In other words, a lot of people, as was intimated earlier, if they don't understand what they see, they immediately label it as a UFO, not in the sense of I don't know what it is, but a UFO in the sense of it is clearly extraterrestrial. My friend thinks the object is as big as 2 airliners. I have never figured out how people can estimate the size of something when the something they're looking at is effectively a point of light. If you can't actually see something big in front of you and say, well, I know how far away it is and I can judge how big it looks, therefore I know how big it is, how can you judge that this is the size of 2 airliners? In this particular case, his friend says it's 2 airliners. The person who took the photo disagreed. I think it's only the size of 1 airliner, but maybe he's right. So what was he looking at? This arc-shaped UFO. Of course, it was Venus. And in this particular case, if we look at an extreme zoom of one of the frames taken by this individual, it was a bridge camera with an extreme zoom, and eventually he got it steady enough to produce an image, and it looks like it's a relatively thin crescent Venus at a relatively early phase of its motion. But again, this comes back to, if you don't know what it is, you don't find somebody who knows what it is, you immediately think it's a UFO, you post it on the internet, and lots of people say, wow, that is definitely proof of aliens. Yes. So some UFOs might be man-made, some might be natural, some are quite definitely image artifacts. And you can usually tell which those are fairly quickly just by reading what people say about them. If anybody says, here's a picture which might be a UFO, it's clearly something odd in the photo, but I don't remember seeing it at the time. I took the photo. 99% of the time, that means an image artifact. If they saw something in the sky and photographed it, that's different. But if it's I don't remember seeing that when I took this picture, almost certainly image artifact. One of the earliest I could find that's undeniable, 1952, mysterious lights seen over Washington. Well, actually, they weren't seen Washington, they were photographed over Washington. As far as I can tell, nobody actually saw these flying machines flying over Washington, D.C., but there are pictures, such as this one, that clearly show a swarm of spacecraft behind the Capitol building, at least what I assume is the Capitol building. But have a look at the lights in the foreground there. Take those rather bright lights shining into the camera, take them, turn them upside down, and then just put them up there. Oh, look at that. One object, two objects separated by a little bit more, a couple that can't be seen because they're sort of embedded, if you like, in here, and another one over there, and one that's just off the picture. Every object that is, quote, a UFO, unquote, is a one-to-one correspondence with these lights down in the foreground. If you get bright light shining in a lens, you are bound to get a reflection. Back in 1952, it was very difficult to make multi-coated lenses to minimize those reflections. Even today, with multi-coated lenses, you will minimize the reflections, but if you shine the moon or shine the sun into your lens, you will get a reflection of some kind. So it's no surprise to find that these things exist. Again, you look at the pictures, you look at the reports that come with the pictures. Having a report of a UFO is one thing, but when you see an image and then you read something like this, the large craft came so close to the photographer that the windows can even be seen in the image. I assume by windows they mean these things. This UFO sighting is 100% proof that aliens are here on Earth. Not 99%, but 100%. And they are so confident they put aliens in capitals. That tells you how serious they are about this being proof of aliens. And you can tell that this report does not actually correspond to what they see, because this is an image artifact. This would not have been seen in the sky. So when they say the large craft came so close, they are taking a photograph which has an artifact in it, and they are, as it were, back engineering a story which seems to back up what they're showing. But actually that shape we can see there, if we look at the whole picture, the moon, the full moon, I'm not sure if it's full or crescent or half, can't really tell from this, but a very bright moon is shining directly into the camera lens and producing a horrible reflection. It's not a particularly high quality lens, I don't think, because this is a rather extreme distortion of an image, but that can happen depending on the quality of the lens. It's slightly off center, the moon is not necessarily in the center of the image, and therefore the reflection is not necessarily centered and is very distorted. But that is quite definitely not an object in the sky, it's just a result of how the image was taken, how the picture was taken, how the photograph was taken. Another one which is perhaps a little more innocent and a little more recent is an individual who put this onto Twitter and said, I was taking this picture of this lamp because I thought it looked pretty. And at the time, I didn't notice this UFO in the background that seems to be hovering there, and there's a little bit of an aura around it. What is this in the sky? It seems to have an aura around it. Is it a UFO? This particular person has posted it on Twitter, and because it's Twitter, it gets the hashtag UFO. And because this individual is genuinely asking the question, I don't know what it is it a UFO? It came with the hashtag serious question. So they did actually want somebody to respond with what the answer was, or is it actually a UFO? But it doesn't take too much. Perhaps you have to have a certain mindset. My research at university is in image analysis and image processing. So whenever I see an image, I start to deconstruct it and ask myself what's going on. That's what got me interested in things like UFO images. In this particular case, if you take the image and blow it up a bit, what are we actually looking at? Well, we're looking at apparently a disk which has had the left-hand side cut off, and it seems to be superposed with these shadows of whatever they are. And then you can ask yourself, well, where would such an image come from? Well, what's happening with this lamp is the sun is just peeking round the side of the building. The sun is a disk. If it's just peeking round the side of the building, it'll be a disk that's been cut off. And the sun is shining through the filigree work of this particular lamp support. which is exactly what we're seeing here. This filigree work is simply what's in here, which we can't see because it's so overexposed in the direct image, but that is basically just an image of what's there, and it's upside down, again, because it's a reflection. And again, even with a good quality lens, you might still get a reflection like that simply because the sun is shining straight into the camera and there's bound to be reflections off various lens surfaces. So again, an easy explanation, especially when you just zoom in and have a look at what's actually going on there. Another example where the picture itself does not correspond to the text that comes with it is this one. They say, here's the image, and I challenge you to figure out what the hell it is we're looking at in this particular case. They say, note the power lines in the photo, which I think means these straight lines that you can see, perhaps one of them there, and I think there's a straight line there and a straight line there. As you see, the wires, I assume that's what they mean, show no distortion, absolutely no distortion, which would indicate no camera jerk. So they're using these straight lines here to justify the fact that their camera has been absolutely steady and hasn't moved at all relative to the object. Also, based on the wires in the photo, you can tell that we were shooting almost straight up. I haven't got a clue how they come to that conclusion that because we're looking at wires in the photo, they were shooting almost straight up. But I looked at that image, couldn't quite work out what was going on, so I just did a little bit of image processing, and now I trust you can pretty much see what we're looking at. We're looking through a window of a vehicle, might be a car, might be a truck, might be a bus, not too sure. There's the road outside, illuminated by the headlights. There's a wing mirror on this left-hand side, which is presumably the driver's side if we're talking about America, and there's darkness in the distance and maybe some lights over there. But these lines are nothing to do with wires. They are nothing to do with proving that the camera isn't moving. This wing mirror is slightly out of focus and the objects in the distance are a little bit more focused, but this is quite definitely the picture out of somebody's window, car, bus, truck window, as they're traveling along. These are probably scratches if this was film rather than the CCD image, and this is quite definitely not looking up into the sky at some sort of a UFO. So this is another example where somebody's taken a picture and then invented a story trying to back up what that picture is showing. That's the problem with a lot of UFO reports, is people will simply invent the report, the text, because they think it backs up what they've photographed. This is one of my favorites. Here we have a huge slab in the sky. What appears to be a flat, rectangular aircraft with lights around its edges, as you can see there, hovering in the air. UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists have claimed that it's an advanced type of spycraft known as a TR-3B. Giving it a code name makes it sound more real if you call it a TR-3B rather than just a large slab in the sky. What is it we're looking at? Well, it appears to be a rather cloudy night. Perhaps it's raining. If you look at these cars in the distance with their headlights shining towards us, there seems to be reflections in the road, indicating it's wet, and there appear to be raindrops here, indicating it's been raining. So I would argue, almost certainly, we're looking through the windscreen of a car. If we're looking through the windscreen, is it possible that this object up here, this large black object, flat, rectangular, with shiny edges, is it possible that's a UFO? Or is it possible that it's an iPhone with a silver edge that's sitting on the dashboard of the car and is reflected in the windscreen that you're photographing through? So basically, you've just got an iPhone sitting on the dash, you photograph the sky, and you pick up the reflection of the iPhone that's sitting there. Is that, according to Occam's razor, a simpler explanation than assuming that you have a large slab-like object, rectangular aircraft floating in the sky? You decide. So we've seen man-made objects, we've seen natural objects, we've seen image artifacts. The fourth category is UFOs might be faked. Any picture that requires somebody using their finger to point at it is clearly a fake. Who in their right mind is going to photograph a UFO and before taking the picture put their finger into the picture to make it clear what it is they're supposed to be photographing. Also, things like this. If there was a UFO about a couple of miles in diameter hovering over an interstate in America, I think people would notice. Apart from having one image here, I think a few thousand other people might say, we've seen something absolutely amazing. This is often quoted as, well, clearly we have a couple of UFOs buzzing Air Force One here. I had a look at this, and in this particular case, I didn't have to do a huge amount of image processing. It only took me a few seconds to look at that to figure this image is a fake. And one of the reasons is the Air Force One is quite some considerable distance away, and so the atmosphere between us and Air Force One has A, made it a little bit blurry, and B, reduced the contrast. That's what large amounts of air does to any light from a distance. So you can see the underside of Air Force One should be quite dark, but it's not quite black, and the top isn't quite white. You look at the contrast in these objects, they seem to be a lot sharper and a lot higher contrast than Air Force One. If they're at a similar distance with whatever it is, a mile or 2 miles of air between us and this distant aircraft, then we would expect them to be somewhat blurred by the turbulent atmosphere between us and them, and also their contrast should be reduced as well. So that, I'm convinced, is a fake image. And when it came to this one, a triangular UFO sitting on the deck of an aircraft carrier, a UFO, a helicopter, and an F-18 jet, I thought, that's interesting. I wonder if I can prove that that's a fake. It looks like a fake to me, but that's not quite the same thing as saying, can you prove it? So again, because my background is in image processing, I thought, what can I do with this to prove what's going on here? So what I did was ask myself, what is the intensity of the background pixels? I'm not going to look at the UFO itself. I'm not going to look at the aircraft. I'm going to look at the tarmac. Well, not tarmac, the bed of the aircraft carrier. And if I look at the grey pixels close to this F-15 and plot out how bright are the pixels as a function of position, I've just taken a little region within that blue circle there. So I've taken a line of grey pixels and I've said how bright are they. Doesn't matter what the numbers mean. They come between 65 and 70 units of brightness. Let's not worry about what the units are. And they vary a little bit. That's perfectly natural. There's always going to be some variation from one pixel to the next. If you were to take a picture of this wall, for instance, it wouldn't come out to be all the same brightness. There would be tiny variations, partly because the wall itself is not uniform, and partly because the camera you use to record the picture will have a little bit of noise in it. So there's always going to be some variation, some natural variation of pixel intensities from one pixel to the next, even though they are very similar shades of grey or very similar colors. When I did the same to the region close to the UFO, I picked a region close to the edge of the triangle. And when I did that, I found it doesn't matter what the numbers are. What matters is the fact that the variation is perfectly natural until you get close to the UFO. And then it is absolutely suspiciously dead flat, absolutely the same pixel value, no variation whatsoever until you get to the other side, and then it goes back to being natural again. That is 100% quite definitely a doctored photo, and therefore it is not unreasonable to assume that somebody has just taken an image of a UFO taken from, I don't know, it might be CGI, it might have been taken from some other context. It's been pasted into this image, and then somebody has tried to tidy up the edges by doing a little bit of processing and has smoothed it out to the point where it no longer looks natural. So that is quite definitely a faked UFO image. Along the same lines, there's an image here which is shocking new footage of an alien ship over Chicago, one of the best sightings of 2015 apparently. Very little you can see, taken at night, of this image, but it doesn't take too much image processing to bring it out, and then you see what's actually in the image. This mottling in the background, again, is perfectly normal variations. Some of you who've done astrophotography, you try and expand the contrast scale. Sometimes your night sky comes out looking a little bit speckly. Well, this is just perfectly normal noise It depends on what was in the original image, and it depends on how it's been saved as a JPEG image. If you look at the object itself, this triangular UFO, notice that although the background is quite mottly, the UFO looks extremely sharp. That edge, or those two edges in particular, are way too sharp to be natural. If you actually imaged that object in the sky, then that edge would come out as rough of some of this mottling that you can see in the background. So that is definitely artificially way too sharp to be real. So that again is quite definitely a faked, possibly photoshopped image. In this particular case, it's a still from a video of somebody who was shooting out the window of their commercial aircraft, and they saw this UFO fly by. Well, it is possibly an extraterrestrial spacecraft, but it bears a remarkable resemblance to the sort of spacecraft that you get in computer video games, such as Halo, for instance. The computer game Halo uses a ship called a Pelican, which was based on the dropship of Alien. If you remember Alien, when they get dropped from the Nostromo, that's the ship they use. Okay, it's possibly a coincidence, but I don't think so. I think somebody has simply taken a graphic from a video game like Halo and has simply placed it into this video of them looking out of the plane window to try and convince you that they've seen a UFO fly by. No, not convinced, sorry. And then we finally get to the fifth possibility. We've looked at man-made objects, natural objects, image artifacts, and deliberate fakery. But what about the fifth possibility, that UFOs seen in our skies are extraterrestrial spacecraft? Well, somebody's done a very good job of cataloguing them for us, which is very handy. You can see A1, A2, A3, B4, B5, etc. I find this fascinating for two reasons. A, there's an awful lot of UFOs. B, you can't see it probably, but it says down here, based on actual sightings. Yes, okay, so these aren't just fanciful ideas. These are actual sightings which have been described by people. How you take descriptions from somebody and write them down and determine that A5 is different from A6, I mean, they must have described these things in exceptional detail. It's a shame we don't have any photographs, but no, we only are basing this on descriptions and sightings. So I find that quite interesting, that it's based on sightings. The other thing I find interesting about this chart is that this is a UFO sightings set 1. So this is 80 of them. I presume there's a set 2 somewhere, and I'm not sure how many sets there are, but clearly some people believe that there are many hundreds of different types of UFO spacecraft that have been visiting the Earth. But what I really find unacceptable is some of the rhetoric that's used in TV programs, where they say, look, here, Rendlesham Forest, look, there's evidence that a UFO has actually landed. You can see it here. And you look at that and think, well, I see a forest. I don't see evidence of a UFO. And then they say, well, okay, let's make it easier for you. There is quite obviously the footprint of a triangular UFO. And they deliberately change the image and say, look, you can see where the 3 landing feet were. I look at that and say, well, that's 3 random bits of dark in a forest floor. How you can pick out any 3 patches and say that's clearly evidence of a triangular ship with 3 feet that's landed at that point, that is stretching things to what I would regard as way beyond the extreme. But if we do think about extraterrestrials, if we say there are no images in existence that require an extraterrestrial origin, then it leads back to the opposite question. If you say, well, the number of stars in the Milky Way is of order, what, 300 billion? It used to be that we didn't know how many of those stars had planetary systems. As of the last decade or two, we now have a very good idea of how many of those 300 billion stars have planetary systems. And it's roughly half of them, much more common than we first thought. Of those planetary systems, how many might have an Earth-like planet? Again, until relatively recently, we had no idea what the answer was in terms of what fraction might be Earth-like. Now we have a very good idea, thanks to things like Kepler spacecraft having mapped out thousands of different exoplanets. We now know that Earth-like planets are quite common. Perhaps 1 in 5, maybe 1 in 6 stars have Earth-like planets around them. So that means there's something like 50 billion in the Milky Way. It is very difficult, nay, almost impossible, to say on how many of those planets might life have originated. Some say if you have the right conditions, if you have an Earth-like planet, if you have liquid water, life is inevitable. It will happen. Other people say life is very unlikely. We don't know what the answer is. It's somewhere in between. It'll never happen or it'll always happen, but we don't know what the answer is. If we assume that 99% of the time an Earth-like planet does not develop life, that means we'll only have about 500 million planets in the Milky Way. What's the likelihood that if you start with simple life, you might end up with complex, many-celled organisms? Again, we have no idea if the answer is very likely or very unlikely. Let's assume that 99% of the time, life does not develop into complex life, in which case we're down to 5 million. And then, of course, the biggie is how often will complex life develop into intelligent life? Again, we have no idea, but let's assume that 99% of the time, if complex life develops, it doesn't go any further to intelligent life. So now we're down to 50,000. 50,000 is still a big number. And that's only one galaxy, of course. The universe is full of 1 trillion galaxies. So it's actually 50,000 trillion in terms of the total number of planets that might produce life, if we assume that life occurs as a 1 in a million event. Even if it's 1 in a billion event, that's still an awful lot of planets. How come we haven't seen any evidence? How come we haven't heard anything? How come, people will argue, we haven't been visited? The Drake equation is not an answer, it's just a point to help us phrase what the questions are. Perhaps you recognize this, the pale blue dot. Look again at that dot, that's here, that's home, that's us. On it, every human being who ever was lived out their lives on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. Pale blue dot, Carl Sagan, 1994. The pale blue dot reminds us that the only life we know about is life on Earth. And even if UFOs exist in the skies above us, that is not evidence, it is not proof that we have ever been visited by extraterrestrials. But what I find more unsettling than that is the concept that we might actually be alone. Thank you for listening.